A small recap of previous topics which we have discussed. The first one is the National Forest Policy. We are having the National Forest Policy of 1988 for the forest specifically, right? So this is related to the environmental stability of the forest, maintaining its ecological balance as well as the atmospheric equilibrium. When we are speaking about the forest, we need to here mention certain provisions related to the tribals and denudation as well as Rajasthan deserts. That is what the forest policy is. The forest policy is which discuss 33% of the total area of the forest, right? Now, when we are speaking about the forest, we need 33% of the forest area. And this policy is in 1988. It is not updated as a drawback. And sustainability, stability of environment, ecological balance, and efficient utilization of the forest produce. Tribals meet their minor forest produce without the use of wood, that is substitution of the wood, and opportunity for the work for the tribals. Natural heritage should be conserved, soil erosion and denudation, and Rajasthan deserts. Then we have Biological Diversity Act. First, this act is for biological resources. Now, what is a biological resource? Any plant, animal, or microorganisms. It is not a human being or it is not a value added product, right? This plant, animal, or microorganisms must have a genetic material, using of its genetic material and byproducts. So, whenever we are dealing about the Biological Diversity Act, we need to think about the biological resources. Again, what is biological resources? Now, what we have to use, we have to sustainably use them, conserve these biological resources, and benefit sharing. Just 3 points: conserve these resources, sustainably use these resources, as well as benefit sharing, right? Benefit sharing when we are using the knowledge of local communities. That's it. Now we have like boards or authorities, right? National Biodiversity Authority, State Biodiversity Board, and at the local level Biodiversity Management Committee, right? Now, the central government has to consult the National Biodiversity Authority with respect to what species. If some species is threatened, right? If some species is being threatened, how come biological research activity can be done on those species? We cannot extract or use those species, right? So, notifying a threatened species, it is going to prohibit or regulate the collection and designate institutions or repositories. Right. Now, first, when we are speaking about the Biological Diversity Act 2002, right? The first thing is biological resources. We are going to deal with the biological resources. Now, what is the biological resources and what we have to do? We have to conserve them and we have to sustainably use them. Benefit sharing. These are the 3 points. Then we have a board over here: National Biodiversity Authority, State Biodiversity Board, and Biodiversity Management Committee for threatened species, right? After that, we have to mention that individual level, how can we approach the National Biodiversity Board? If we are an individual is doing a research, he needs a permission. If he is transferring the research to some other organization, he needs a permission. And for patent claim also, he needs a permission from the National Biodiversity Authority. This is what Biological Diversity Act 2002 is. Recently, there was an amendment in 2023, right? We are telling about the benefit sharing, right? Now, what is the issue over here? For research, it is restricting because of the benefit sharing, because pharmaceutical companies has to produce a lot of medicines. Therefore, it is affecting the research sharing. Here, the restricting of the research is a drawback for the pharmaceutical. Therefore, we say that here that the use of codified traditional knowledge. If somebody is having a codified traditional knowledge, they need not do a benefit sharing. And also Ayush practitioners need not do benefit sharing. Research or biosurvey activities need not do benefit sharing. And the benefit sharing is thus the agreement between the user and the local board, local management committee. Where in the local management committee, so no direct involvement of the locals actually, right? And we have Biological Amendment Act, Biodiversity Amendment Act 2023. Now we say here the claim of IPR. Initially, what we have to do, we have to claim for IPR, we have to submit the details, right? And only during the final approval of the IPR, only before the final approval of the IPR, we have to get the NBA approval, not in the initial stages of application processes, right? This is what we'll be dealing with the Biological Diversity Act. An Indian company, what as an Indian company means is also defined in this amendment. Next, we are having the Forest Rights Act is for the forest dwellers. We have forest dwellers, and these forest dwellers need minor forest produce. Therefore, we have scheduled tribes and other traditional forest dwellers. There are two types of categories of people in the Forest Rights Act 2006. The first one is the scheduled tribes. The first one is the tribes, and the second one is going to be a traditional forest dweller. Right, a tribe and a traditional forest dweller. Recognition of the forest rights. This is going to be the livelihood of the people. Scheduled tribes, forest dwellers, and other forest dwellers. For scheduled tribes, we have a list of scheduled tribes by the central government, so they need not prove, right. Just they are giving a date. ST in area which is presiding before 2006 means in December, right? December 13, 12, 2005. They should depend on the forest for their livelihood. But other forest dwellers, they should be 3 generations and they should have proof of 3 generations, 75 years, prior to 13, 12, 2005. Now, land rights and maximum land is 4 hectare. They have a land in the forest, and this forest includes sanctuaries as well, national park, everything as well, and right of ownership of minor forest produce. The rights of Forest Rights Act deals with the forest ownership, whereas we have biological resources is what discovered in the Biodiversity Act of 2002. Then national forest is related to the forest, 33% of the forest cover, and efficient utilization of the forest produce. And next we are discussing related to Convention on Migratory Species. Convention on Conservation of Migratory Species migrates from one place to another. Here we have only 2 appendix. One is an endangered species, and other species which needs conservation, right? It is a part of UNEP, United Nations Environment Program, right? It is a part of the UNEP. And India is a part of this migratory species, a wild animal which is avian, aquatic, terrestrial. We have, it is also known as a Bond Convention. So United Nations, sorry, it's not United Nations. It is Convention on Conservation of Migratory Species. It is also known as the Bond Convention. And CITES is also belongs to UNEP. And it is the only treaty for the migratory species at the global level. It was adopted in 1979 and it enacted in 1983, right? It is legally and non-legally binding conventions. It covers a native state, an intermediate state, and a range state. Appendix 1 and Appendix 2. But for CITES, we have 3 appendices. For CITES is related to the international trade in the endangered species. It is a convention on the international trade in the endangered species of flora and the fauna. It belongs to UNEP, right? The headquarters is in the Geneva, Switzerland. It was adopted in 1963 and it was enacted in 1975. Its trade is legally binding on all the parties and helps the parties for domestic legislation. From this CITES, we have the Wildlife Protection Act. So CITES is related to the Convention on the International Trade in Endangered Species, right? CITES and Wildlife Protection Act are related to each other. Headquarters is in Geneva, Switzerland. Appendix 1 is there is a danger of extinction, and Appendix 2 is it needs monitoring so that it is not becoming a threat, and Appendix 3 is least concern. So here the Appendix 1 is related to the extinction, right? And Appendix 2 and Appendix 3. This is enough. And NGO is called as a traffic. It is also related to Wildlife Trade Monitoring Network and World Wildlife Fund for Nature and IUCN. These two have established the traffic. Traffic is by WWF and IUCN. Trade in the wildlife, flora and fauna is not a threat to the conservation of nature. Now, let us discuss about IUCN. IUCN was formed in 1948. We have IUCN in 1948. Right. The first thing is an international, we have to know the definition of or acronym IUCN is expanded to International, it is an internationally we are having a union, right? International union. This union is for conservation. Conservation of the nature. Its headquarters is in Gland, Switzerland. When we had a recap, we can say that traffic is in London. The headquarters of traffic is in London. And the headquarters of the sites is in Geneva, Switzerland. Right. Now, these are the three places which we are seeing related to the headquarters. Gland, Switzerland is for IUCN. Right. It is to influence, encourage and assist societies to conserve the integrity and diversity of nature and to ensure that any use of natural resources is equitable and ecologically sustainable. For sustainable and ecologically equitable. Its member can be a government or a civil society organization. So who can be the members of IUCN? Members can be government as well as the civil society organization. Now, IUCN World Conservation Congress in Marshall adopted by democratic vote, we have a Nature 2030 IUCN program. Right. There is a program over here. It is a special program. It is related to sustainable development goals. Right. This program is known as the IUCN This was held at the World Conservation Congress. This Congress was held in the Marseille. It has adopted the Nature 2030 IUCN program. Now, what is this Nature 2030 IUCN program? It has people at the center. It has people at the center. And it is divided into 4. The first one is land, water, climate, and oceans. Right. Land, water, climate, and then we have the oceans. Now, what we have to do, all the 4 is we need to recognize them and retain them. Retain. Recognize, retain, we need to restore them, resource them, and reconnect them. So this is related to, these goals are related to, similar to sustainable development goals. This is what we have to learn about IUCN is. It is a full form is International Union for Conservation of Nature and headquarters is at the Switzerland, Gland, and it was formed in 1948. Sustainability and ecological equitability. Members are government as well as civil society. IUCN World Conservation Congress in Marshall has adopted a Nature 2030 IUCN program, and this is the program, right? The next thing we have to mention, most important is, we all know that IUCN is having the Red Data book. It was first released in 1966 and from that keep on adding, right? Now it is having 2 types of pages. The first one is going to be like pink pages. right? The pink pages are, we have critically endangered. So the pink pages denote the critically endangered species. A species which is critically endangered belongs to the pink page. And we also have green page. I also have the green page. Green page is previously it is endangered. Previously we say that it is endangered. But now it has recovered. So a point. Right. Now it has been recovered. That's all. Now we have to know the orders, right? And orders and details related to the IUCN list for the species. First, it is extinct. It is not available, right? And then we have extinct in wild. Then critically endangered. Followed by endangered. Right. And then we have the vulnerable. After that, we'll be having near threatened. Least concern. It is threatened and then we say it is least concern. Data sufficient. And not evaluated. It follows like extinct. It is extinct in the wild, right? Critically endangered is like CR. Endangered is EN. Vulnerable is VU, is what vulnerable, right? And near threatened is NT. Least concern is LC. Data is not sufficient and not evaluated. Now these things like critically endangered, endangered, vulnerable, near threatened, right? These all categorized into like threatened categories. These belongs to the threatened categories. We all know that extinct means it is not present. Extinct in the wild. It denotes like it is we need to preserve it. Therefore, it is captively bred. Captive breeding is done to preserve it. And it is not available in the wild. We are doing captive breeding to preserve it. Now, what is critically endangered? Critically endangered means there is a reduction in population. The population is reducing to greater than 90% over last 10 years. In just 10 years, it is reduced to more than 90% is what we have critically endangered, and the population size is also less than 50 mature individuals. 50 like mature individuals who are able to reproduce, right? We are not including the newborn animals or individuals. So less than 50 mature individuals, right? This is what we say it as critically endangered. Plus, there would be some species, right? Those who are in the wild as well as those who are in the captive like zoos. So we say extinct even it is in the wild. Extinct in wild is at least 50% in 10 years. and it is having an extremely high risk of extinction in the wild. High risk of extinction. We can captively breed and we can keep its population also, right? High risk of extinction in the wild. So we are ignoring the fact of captive breedings and the number in the captive breeding. Only in the wild it should be greater than 50%. At least 50% in 10 years. In the wild, and it is having a high risk of extinction in the wild only. In general, if we are considering 90%, more than 90% in extinct in over the last 10 years, and it is having not less than 50 mature individuals. Now, what does endangered means? Now, the same thing we need to mention, right? Reduction in the population. Now, we are mentioning the same thing over here. Reduction in the population for endangered. But here also we are mentioning instead of less than 90%, we are mentioning it as less than 70% for endangered. So for endangered, we are using 70% over the same 10 years, right? So reduction in the population, it is going to be, greater than 70% is being reduced. Greater than 70% is reduced over the last 10 years. We say greater than 70% reduced over the last 10 years. The same concept is repeating. And less than 250. Get it more closely. Less than 250 mature individuals. We have only 250, right? Now, extinct in wild concept is also applying because we are having captive breeding concept, right? So, the extinct in wild, we say that extinct in wild, at least, we have to use a word called as at least 20% within. Now only we are changing the years. 20 years. 20% within 20 years. Right. And it is also having a high risk of extinction in the very high risk. Same line. Very high risk of extinction in wild. So this is what for endangered. The next thing is vulnerable, right? So I am just mentioning everything is 10 years only. For the first line, it is greater than 50% is lost. And how much individuals? 10,000 mature individuals. From 250, we are getting it into 10,000. This is also over last 10 years, 50% if it is extincted, we call it as vulnerable. 70% if it is extincted over the last 10 years, we call it as endangered. And 90%, greater than 90%, it is critically endangered. 50, 250 and 10,000 mature individuals. And extinct in the wild is more than 50%, more than 20%, and it is at least 10%. At least 10%. At least 10% in the within 100 years. Extinct in the wild, we are calculating 100 years. So first it is 10 years, next it is 20 years, and now we have the 100 years, right? And high risk of extinction, same line will come. High risk of extinction in the wild. In the wild. Now we are seeing IUCN risk, what does it considers, right? We are not having, we just need to know about the critically endangered and vulnerable. So critically endangered, more than 90% of the population is being reduced. Less than greater than 90% is being population is being lost, and 70%, 50% all belong to 10-year period, right? 50 mature individuals, 250 mature individuals, 10,000 mature individuals. Endangered, and then we have the vulnerable, right? Near threatened, least concern. Near threatened, least concern, data sufficient and not evaluated. So just three are more important: critically endangered, vulnerable. Near threatened, least concern, and data not sufficient, not evaluated. Extinct and wild, at least 50% in 10 years, and at least 20% within 20 years, at least like 10% within 100 years, right? The percentage is decreasing, but the years are increasing. Similarly, the percentages are decreasing, but the mature individuals are increasing. These are the things which we have to remember. Now, certain facts related to the IUCN is, can write it above. Now, we say that IUCN is going to consist of the threatened plants, a threatened plant, and animal species only. Animals only. It is not considering an endemic. It considers only the threatened plants and animals. It does not consider endemic. In India, let us have certain endangered species in India. India endangered. So what are certain endangered species in India? We have Great Indian Bustard, right? Great Indian Bustard, musk deer, red panda, Asiatic wild ass. These are the things which is related to IUCN. These four alone are as threatened categories, right? After IUCN, the next thing which we are going to see is Environment Protection Act of 1986. Certain acts like environment protection. We need to protect the environment, right? So Environment Protection Act of 1986. Now, what is the background for this? The first background is the Bhopal tragedy. The Bhopal tragedy is related to Bhopal tragedy is the first background, and the Bhopal tragedy is related to methyl isocyanide gas leak. It is a pesticide plant. This happened in 1984. So methyl isocyanide gas leak from a pesticide plant, 1984. Then we also have the United Nations is having a conference, right? United Nations is having a conference on the human environment. But this happened in 1972 itself. Now, what is the aim? Its aim is to protect and improve human environment and prevent hazards to the human beings and other creatures. It covers various acts, and we say, right, we have standards for quality of environment. Protects environment include air pollution, water pollution, right? So everything related to the pollutants. This act deals with the control of the pollutants. Now in the Environmental Protection Act, Water Act, Air Act belongs to this. Now it covers various acts like Water Act, Air Act. Now the central government is having full power. The central government is having the full power for protecting and improving the quality of the environment. From this act, we have standards for the quality of environment. Then we will be having for the quality of the environment, this is for the emissions and emissions of the pollutants. Emissions of pollutants. It is to prohibit or regulate industries. The next thing is related to regulate or stop the supply of electricity or water or any other service. So these are the most important points which is related to the Environment Protection Act 1986. The next thing which we are going to see is the Forest Conservation Act of 1980. Right. Why do we need a Forest Conservation Act 1980? And a recent amendment to this is in contradiction to the Tribal Forest Rights Act of 2006. We have the forest conservation. We need to conserve the forest, right? So the 33% conservation which is mentioned in the National Forest Policy, right? Forest conservation, and this is the Act of 1980. This Act is having an amendment 2002. Not an amendment, a rule. Forest Conservation Rule 2002. Then we have Forest Conservation Rule 2022. Now under the Forest Conservation Rule of 2022, we are going to see the highlights of Forest Conservation Rules of 2022. We are having a 3-member committee or a 3-level committee. This is a 3-level committee. 3 committees. Right. The first one is at the central government or the national level. We have Regional Empowered Committee. Regional Empowered Committee. At the central government level, it has to meet 2 times a month. And next we'll be having the Project Screening Committee. The screening is done by the central government. So Project Screening Committee. This is by the state government and it is also meets 2 times a month. The third one is an advisory committee which is of central government. Advisory committee. First, it is related to a regional empowered committee, screening and advisory committee which is of central government and it is having 6 members. State government / the union territory for the project screening committee, right? What do they do? Why we need Forest Conservation Act? We have mining and non-mining projects, right? Approval of the projects. Mining and non-mining projects. Then we go for the final approval by the nodal officer after central government gives approves. Once the central government, that is a regional empowered committee, it must approve. Then only we have the final approval. For final approval is from the or by the nodal officer. This final approval is only after the central government approves. We are dealing with compensatory afforestation, right? Now there is also a change with respect to compensatory afforestation. Now usually when we are cutting down certain forest area, this is when we are cutting down certain forest area, we are going for the Forest Conservation Act, right? For projects, we have 3 committees for the projects. The first one is a regional empowered committee by the central government. We have an empowered committee, a regional empowered committee by the central government, and a project screening committee by the state government, even an advisory committee by the central government, which is 6 members. For mining and non-mining projects, we have a nodal officer who approves after the central government has approved. Now, this is related to compensatory afforestation when we are having a state or the state is going to be a hilly or a mountainous state, right? Hilly or we have a mountainous state. This state is having a green cover. So the green cover of the state of over 2/3 of the geographical area. Its entire area it is having 2/3 is the green cover. And forest cover is 1/3 of the geographical area. Of that geographical area. So basically when a state is having more than greater than 33% of the forest cover, a state is already having forest cover, right? 33% of the forest cover. So compensatory afforestation, such a state, here compensatory afforestation in case of a project in this state can be done in other states, right? Compensatory afforestation can be done in other states or the union territories where the cover is less than 20%. So we say that the cover is less than 20%. In such states, compensatory afforestation can be diverted from state A to state B. Right? This is what amendments. According to the amendment or the rule, right? Based on this act, we are having a rule. Forest conservation rule. This rule is going to speak about a 3-member committee. Not 3-member, I'm so sorry. 3 committees. The first one is a regional empowered committee, project screening committee, advisory committee. Regional empowered, project screening, forest advisory committee. Now mining and non-mining projects, and the final approval is by the nodal officer only after the central government approves it. Right. Here it speaks about the compensatory afforestation. In the compensatory afforestation, the states which are already having green cover is 2/3 of the geographical area. Forest cover is 1/3 of the geographical area. Such a state, the compensatory afforestation can be done in other states where the green cover is less than 20%. Now we are speaking about the tribal rights also. It speaks about the compensatory afforestation, this recent rule of 2022. It also speaks about the tribal rights. So non-forest activity diversion. Previously it requires the permission of the local people, that is the Gram Sabha, right? Now it does not need the permission. We have the non-forest activity diversion. When there is a non-forest activity diversion, does not require, now it does not require local people's permission. The local people permission. Right. So this is going to affect Forest Rights Act. 2006. Right. The rules will allow, this is going to allow the private developers. The private developers who are doing the non-forest diversion to clear the forest. They can clear the forest without seeking permission of the forest dweller. Right. It means central government has the right. So who is having the right to permit now? The central government is having the right to permit the clearance of the forest without informing to the authentic residents. Without informing its residents. Right. Now, the residents won't have any claim over the forest area in case of diversion to the non-forestry activities. Finally, we say that the residents, they do not have, right? The residents do not have any claim. Now they won't have a claim over their forest area. Over their own forest area in case of any diversion to non-forestry activities. So this is what we have: the tribal rights and the compensation, related to the compensation and related to the tribal rights. It does not require the local people's permission. It affects the Forest Right Act of 2006. The private developers can clear the forest without seeking the permission of the forest dwellers. Right. It means that the central government is having the right to permit the clearance of forest without informing its authentic residents. Rights: residents do not have any claim over the forest area in case of any diversion to the non-forestry activities. The next thing which we are going to deal is the Wildlife Protection Act of 1972. Now, here it had an amendment in 2021. We have the Wildlife Protection Act of 1972. It had an amendment meant in 2021. Okay. Previously, what did the amendment did? Previously, it had 6 schedules, but now it is having only 4 schedules. Previously, it had 6 schedules, but now it is having only 4 schedules. Right. Now, what is this Wildlife Protection Act? For protection of various species of animals and plants, right, and management of their habitats, regulate, we have to control the trade, protection and control the trade. In short words, we can write that protection and control of trade in wild animals as well as their products and their products. So the wild animals and their products, right. This act lists the schedules of plants and animals that are afforded varying degrees of protection and monitoring by the government. Now, India, when it entered to the CITES Convention, it made it easy for the Wildlife Act. Right. We already know that this act, as of now, it is having 4 schedules. As of now, it is having 4 schedules. So let us discuss those 4 schedules under this act as of now. Schedule 1. Schedule 2. Then we have the Schedule 3. And we have Schedule 4. Now, what is Schedule 1? It contains animals which is enjoying highest level. These animals are enjoying the highest level of protection. Right. So these animals which are having highest level of protection, this is going to contain the animal species. Animals with lesser degree of protection. Now, Schedule 3 is going to contain the protected plant species. Protected plant species. And Schedule 4 is going to have the specimens under sites. Now, what are the important details related to the Act? Now we can say that the first thing we have to note it down is the Act. It permits the use of, what do we use? The use of elephants. Elephants are used for religious and other purposes. So elephants are used for religious and other purposes is permitted in this Act. Right. Now we say that the central government is having two types of authorities over here. Under this amendment, now we can say that central government is having a management authority. So management authority and a scientific authority. So we have a management authority and a scientific authority. Now let us discuss about the management authority. What did the management authority do? This management authority, since it is related to science, it is related to import and exports, right? So what did the management authority do? The management authority, it can, first thing is grants. The management authority is the one which grants export permit and import permit. Export and import permit is being granted by the management authority. So export permit as well as the import permit. Right. Registration certificate. If you are growing any species under the Wildlife Act, you are given a registration certificate. Right. This registration certificate, if a person has a species, if a person is having a species, so this management authority also reports the details of transaction with respect to trade, reports the details of the transaction with respect to trade, and it is going to use an identification mark for the species. Use of identification mark. These things are being done by the management authority. Now what happens is, it is prohibiting the modification or removal of the identification mark. It is prohibiting from modifying and removing. Modifying is prohibited as well as removing identification mark. Modification and removing the identification mark is prohibited over here from the management authority. Right. The bill has a separate category of invasive species. In the previous schedules, we had vermin also. Vermin which is declared by the state government. But now here what we are telling is that the vermin. What is a vermin? Vermin is nothing but the species which are an animal that carries diseases. We are having vermin, right? The vermin is nothing but an animal which carries diseases. and it destroys food. Right. Now this vermin category is announced by central government. This vermin category is being announced by the central government. Right. Vermin is a species which destroys food and it also carries diseases. It is announced by the central government under the Wildlife Protection Act as well. Now, the bill has a category of invasive species. We are dealing with the invasive species, right? So, this bill has a category of invasive species. Right. Now, what does it do? It empowers the central government to regulate or prohibit the import, trade, and possession or proliferation of invasive alien species. It empowers the central government to regulate. The central government is regulating, prohibit or to prohibit. We have the import, trade, or even the possession. Or in fact, we are going to say the proliferation. This is of invasive species. Invasive species which are alien, right? So we can write it as invasive alien species. Invasive alien species. Now, the central government may authorize an officer to seize and to dispose. Seize and dispose the invasive species. Right. This is related to the invasive species. Then we have Chief Wildlife Warden as well. So first we are discussing about the invasive species category which the bill has. And previously we discussed about the management authority and the schedules which are mentioned in the Wildlife Protection Act. Now we need to look into the Chief Wildlife Warden. We have the Chief Wildlife Warden. Now, over here, the Chief Wildlife Warden is the one who is going to control. We can write it as Chief Wildlife Warden. Right. The Chief Wildlife Warden is to control, manage. They are controlling, managing, and they are maintaining. All the sanctuaries in a state. Right. This Chief Wildlife Warden is appointed by the state government. He must be in accordance with the management plans for the sanctuary. These plans will be prepared as per the guidelines of the central government and as approved by the Chief Warden. For sanctuaries falling under the special areas, the management plan must be prepared after due consultation with the concerned Grama Sabha. Special areas included in the scheduled area or the area where the ST forest dwellers are applicable. Those areas, the Gram Sabha must be consulted. Special areas where we have economically backward areas with predominantly the tribal populations which are notified under the 5th schedule of the constitution. The central government here declares the national parks, right? The state governments, we have the state governments, right? They may declare areas, may declare the areas which are adjacent, the areas adjacent to national park and the wildlife sanctuary as a conservation reserve. Right. Wildlife sanctuaries as a conservation reserve. The bill empowers the central government can also notify the central government can also notify this conservation reserve. Now the bill is having provisions with related to the captive animals. Right. This bill provides for any person to voluntarily, they are voluntarily surrendering the captive animals. Voluntarily surrender any captive animals or the animal products to the chief wildlife warden. Right. There is no compensation. We have to mention that there is no compensation will be paid to the person for surrendering such items. The surrendered items, right? They are the property of the state government. So this is what related to the Wildlife Protection Amendment Act of 2021. Right. Now we are dealing with the legal framework for protection of various species is what we have the Wildlife Protection Act, which is amended as well. Now there are various bodies which are constituted because of the Wildlife Protection Act. We need to look into those bodies. So we have here the bodies which are constituted under the Act. The first one is going to be the National Board for Wildlife. There is a National Board for the Wildlife. Right. What does it do? The National Board of the Wildlife it is an apex body. It is for reviewing all the wildlife matters and approval of the projects around National Park and Wildlife Sanctuary. So the National Board for Wildlife, it is the apex body. This is for review of all wildlife related matters. So we are reviewing all the wildlife related matters. It gives approval for projects in and around. Approval of the projects in and around the national park and wildlife sanctuary. Right. The next thing we will be having is the state board, national board, and then the state board, right? The state board for wildlife. It is constituted under this act. The state board for wildlife is constituted under this act, and the CM of the state is going to be the chairperson of the board. Then we have the Central Zoo Authority. The Central Zoo Authority has 10 members. This includes the chairperson. So these 10 members are going to include the chairperson and a member secretary as well. Recognizes zoo. And it also regulates zoo. Recognizes zoo, regulates the zoo. Next, we have the National Tiger Conservation Authority. So as far as now, we have seen 3 boards. Remaining 2 boards are there which are constituted under this act. The 4th one is the National Tiger Conservation. The Tiger Conservation Authority. NTCA. This was in 2005 for strengthening the tiger conservation. This is for strengthening tiger conservation. Right. We have the Environment Minister is the chairperson. Then the central government on recommendations of this NTCA, central government on recommendations of this NTCA. It declares tiger reserves. Declares the tiger reserves. Now, next thing we are going to see is what are the areas which are protected under this act. You can write it at the top itself. It covers. So we can say that this is going to covers national park, wildlife sanctuary, conservation reserves. Right. Community reserves. Also the tiger reserves. These are the things which are covered under this act. And we have certain initiatives as well. Just three initiatives under this act. What are the three initiatives? The first one initiative is Project Tiger Conservation. Right. So the Project Tiger Conservation. It was launched in 1973. Project Tiger. Then the next one is Project Elephant. It was launched in 1992. Now we have 88 corridors. These corridors are under this act. And now we have to define, right, what is a wildlife corridor. Wildlife corridor. Wildlife corridor is nothing but they are connected with the protected areas. With the protected areas. It allows the movement of animals without interfering. There is no interference. Human settlements. This is what we call it as a wildlife corridor. Right. So these are the things related to the Wildlife Protection Act.